I didn't like the apartment block that we lived in. Everything was worn out or a little broken. Lights were dim or flickering, if they worked at all. The apartment door had to be lifted up when it was opened and closed, or it didn't work properly. The people were also worn out or a little broken in many different ways. The nice man next door to us wore sunglasses even indoors and carried a white hollow cane with him. He cried at night, although I don't know how he cried when he had no eyes beneath his sunglasses. Then there was the lonely woman who lived across from our apartment. Every evening she had a different soldier sleep over in her apartment. I think she threw a lot of slumber parties because people kept mentioning how many men she slept with. And then there was Baba Yaga, who lived down the hall. The stairs always made me sneeze. It always had dirt and dust brought in from the outside by everyone not bothering to wipe their feet. The building had an elevator, but it hadn't worked since before my parents were born. And since we lived on the top floor, that meant that every day we would have to travel down the stairs. And when we were done for the day, we would have to travel up all the stairs as well. All 7 floors, every day. When we left in the morning, every day, Baba Yaga had her broom in hand. An old wooden broom with old bristles, sweeping the dust and dirt on the top landing, pushing it down the stairs, collecting all of the dirt in the building down the stairs, floor by floor. She swept up the hallways, pushing it all towards the stairs, and then down the stairs, before pushing all of it out of the building through the front door. That meant that every morning Baba Yaga was on the top floor to watch me walk out, descending down the stairs. And every evening she was on the ground floor to watch me ascend the stairs. I don't like how she looked at all of the children of the building, like she was measuring the value of meat at the market, like she was trying to find the juiciest cut of beef that she could afford. And Baba Yaga was always the scariest when she was talking to the quiet man. The quiet man wore a blue uniform with a red and white oval patch on his left arm. As for the quiet man's face, I couldn't say. He never took off his mask, a reflective mask that covered his entire face, that I don't know how he ever saw through. He was always somewhere in the apartment block, usually peeking into people's grocery bags, into their apartments, through their windows, through their photo albums, their diaries, or even in their pockets. But no one seemed to talk to the quiet man, except for Baba Yaga and myself. Everyone always pretended he wasn't there at all, like the rest of the Civil Legion. One time when I wanted to ask my mom about the quiet man, I didn't get a chance to ask. I opened my mouth to ask, and I could see the quiet man peering at me over her shoulder. My mother tensed her shoulders with him standing so close, but she kept her eyes and hands focused on the shopping list in front of her, her hands shaking a little, her skin prickling, and her breath visible with him so close. But she didn't say anything, and she didn't look towards him, his head shaking no ever so slightly, and I knew that if I asked, he would just take me away like he did so many others. That was the worst part about the apartment block. Sometimes the quiet man just took people away. Sometimes the people went with the quiet man willingly, his rod in hand and their eyes downcast. No chains, no handcuffs, nothing holding them except the quiet man's presence. And then there was those who fought against the quiet man. Those who fought back or resisted were always beaten by him. Broken noses, black eyes, bleeding mouths, broken teeth, even broken arms and legs made by the quiet man's rod. And yet, every single person who fought against him always walked with him, with their heads held high, eyes shining with pride even if they were swollen shut, their backs straight even in agony, and their bleeding mouths smiling. The quiet man following close behind, but seemingly respectful of these prisoners. When someone was taken away by the quiet man, people always looked away. Even when the prisoners yelled, even when they fought, even when the quiet man beat his chosen victim against a wall and they fought back on shattered limbs, everyone always looked away. And when they were taken away, they were never spoken about again, except in hushed whispers, and their tone made it very clear. Once taken away by the quiet man, you were never going to return. And as much as I hated the apartment block that I lived in, when I woke up in a room that looked just like the apartment that I was raised in, I immediately knew that it wasn't my home. I knew it wasn't my home because the quiet man was there, and I watched as he closed the door just before Nadia, lying next to me, woke up too. "Nadia, I think we need to leave," I told her. She rubbed her eyes as she yawned, peering around the apartment before she asked, "Where is Mom and Dad?" she asked, and I looked around as well. They were gone, and the apartment felt very empty. Now that I had a moment to think and examine the apartment, I could see there was a few things that were just a little off. Even though it was night, I could still see. There was soft light that shone from the dark corners of the room, making the room just bright enough to see. Then there was the smell. It smelled of sawdust and fresh cement, a smell that the apartment would never smell like. It didn't smell like anyone had lived here. There was no smell of candle, no smell of heated tuna, no sweet apple cider. No one had been here, and it seemed like we were the first people here. I think that they were taken away by the quiet man, I told her, pointing out to the door leading out of the apartment. As I pointed out to the apartment door, I could hear Mom's voice calling out, "Nadia, Valeska, help me!" Mom called out from the master bedroom. "It's Mom," Nadia said as she ran towards the voice. "Nadia, wait!" I called out. Something wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something was very wrong with the voice and the way our mom asked for help. Nadia didn't listen. She ran towards the bedroom door, slamming it open and revealing that there was no bedroom inside. Instead, there was a stairwell leading down, 13 steps down to a landing, and 13 more steps from that landing. Dim light bulbs shining. "Mom, are you there?" Nadia yelled down the stairs, her voice echoing back for a moment. "Nadia, stop!" I told her, grabbing her arm before she crossed the threshold. 13 steps, a landing, then 13 more steps. The dim light bulbs, the stories from Mom and Dad. "Let go of me, Valeska! I need to find Mom!" she yelled as I grabbed her other arm and pulled her closer. "Listen closely," I told her, holding a finger up to my lips, shushing us both, as I pointed down the steps. For a quiet and tense moment, there was silence for a long time, until she realized it was silent. No one was calling for us anymore. It was a single call, and then it ended. "Remember what they used to tell us about the stairs?" I told her, and she thought about it before she nodded, and she answered, "Always count the steps before you go down them. Don't go downstairs with 13 steps. You may never come back up again," she said as she counted the steps, as she counted them again. 13 steps down to the landing, and 13 steps down further into the darkness. "What if it is actually Mom?" she asked, and I asked her back. What did Mom tell us to ask if we are ever unsure? I reminded her, as she glanced down the steps as she stopped shaking, and she instead remembered, and she called down the stairs. Does the black moon howl? She called, her voice echoing down the steps. When it reached the bottom, I could hear it echo as something mumbled from the bottom, too quiet for us to hear the words clearly. You need to answer the question, Nadia yelled down the stairs. A light mumble followed her words. It sounded a little like our mother, but a lot like something else. But now Nadia no longer trusted the stairs, her hand on the doorknob. As long as you are aware, as long as you can speak, you are obligated to honestly answer the arch question. Such is the law of chaos. Does the black moon howl? Nadia called again, and now the voice spoke, sounding nothing like our mother, instead sounding like the walls themselves were vibrating. It was like the entire building chose to speak to us in that uncanny voice. Never where the magician performs, the voice said while we closed the door. Nadia was pale as a sheet, and I was as well. The door closed as we both nodded quietly. That was not our mother, and whatever was waiting at the bottom of the stairs was something very old and very powerful, something older and far more powerful than anything we encountered in the apartments we lived in. The apartment with the quiet man, Baba Yaga, and the many strange people in the apartments was like looking down a dark well to the water far down below. It was mysterious and even a little scary looking down it, but at least you can see the bottom to the well, and you know that as old as it was, that it was built by people. The voice on the bottom of the stairwell was like trying to peer into the bottom of Oceanus. It was far older than anything that I knew of, and I couldn't dream of what was on the bottom. But there was something on the bottom, and even though I couldn't see whatever it was, it could see me. Let's try the front door, I suggested, as Nadia agreed. We made our way to the door. While we walked towards the front door, we could hear our parents trying to call us back. Every step we took away from the stairwell, their voices got more desperate. I could hear hurt in their voices, screams like death, screams for help. The pain felt so real, and each step it only got louder. I reached for Nadia's hand. Her fingers are warm and familiar, and for a moment we can ignore the voices as we stand at the front door. At the door, with our hands resting on the wood, we can hear our parents. They no longer scream in pain. They tell us that they are burning in hell, and that they are waiting for us. They tell us that the flames stop hurting after a while. They tell us how the pain is the only thing keeping their bodies together. They tell us that we are the cause of all of their suffering. They tell us that if they leave us, that they will burn forever. My hand slid down to where the doorknob was. My fingers mere centimeters from the knob, when I could hear my mother's voice whispering mere centimeters from my ears. If you leave this room, you will never see us again, she whispered. A distinct voice from the demonic voice is from the rest of the apartment. I paused before I grabbed the doorknob, before I turned to Nadia and she to me. We both heard the same words, and with a nod, I grabbed the door and I opened it. The door opened easily, and when the door opened, the voices stopped calling for us. When we stepped through, I could hear one last whisper in my mother's voice. "Goodbye, my children," she said, and when I stepped into the hallway, I turned to face the apartment we came from. But now it was no longer the familiar home we grew up in. Inside of it was a broken ruin. Wooden splinters and concrete dust filled what was left of the room. There was holes in the walls and ceiling, holes bigger than what was left of the walls. Where the dining table was, it was mostly intact. One leg was broken and it was still standing. And then there was 4 chairs left standing by the dining room table. 2 of the chairs are empty and covered in both cement and wood dust. The other 2 chairs had something still there. It reminded me of the butcher shop, but the meat wasn't hanging from a hook. It was slumped over in the seat. Blood pooled from the seats onto the floor, fading from crimson to brown. The meat still had skin in places, not enough to recognize what it once was. Bone was visible in some places, more yellow than I knew bone could be, with the pink sheen of blood and fluid coating the bones. I couldn't recognize what it used to be based on the skin left. If it wasn't for the clothing left on the flesh, I would have thought it was something from the butcher shop. The door closed, and when I tried to open the door, it stayed shut. Not like it was locked, but like the door wasn't a door, but just a wall with a knob in it. Just like one of the doors to nowhere in the old city, created to trick the spirits and fae away from the actual doors that people use. "We can't go back, can we?" Nadia asked. And I could only shake my head. As certain as I was of the sun and the moon, I was certain that we couldn't go back into that room. When we left it for good. "We have to keep going," I told her as I turned down the hallway. An unfamiliar place with unfamiliar wallpaper. Actual wallpaper that wasn't peeling, wasn't stained, wasn't drawn on. And a rug red as blood and embroidered with gold. The lights were electric and looking like torches. The wallpaper was purple with red roses, green stems, and black thorns. A color so well painted and realistic that it looked like I could reach out and touch it. I reached out only to stop just shy of the roses. Nadia instead reached out and grabbed for the stem, only for her to hiss and pull back, her finger bleeding from where she touched the painted thorn. But with only one way to go, we traveled down the hallway, where we passed by other doors that were open just a crack, and we couldn't help but peek through. On the first door, when we peeked through, I could see a child's bedroom. A lump beneath the covers was a child hiding. The covers hiding the child's complete body. Even their eyes were covered while they hid beneath the covers. Shivering in fear beneath the blanket, folded at the foot of the bed was a military uniform, numerous medals, and an armband with Bathory's crest on it. Beneath the bed, we could see something staring at us. Something with sharp teeth and glowing eyes in the darkness. The next room was overgrown with thorns, thistles, tendrils, and vines that were sharp and deadly looking. In the center of the room was a mummified body, standing alone in a room with no furniture. Except, instead of being wrapped in gauze, like the old kings of Kemet, the body was wrapped in thorny vines. It didn't look like the vines were keeping it imprisoned, More like that the vines were the mummy's bandages, all of its body wrapped in vines and tendrils, except for a single bloodshot eye on the mummy's face. When it turned to face us, tendrils and vines broke over the mouth. Broken teeth and a dry tongue were visible, and a rotten scream that we could smell from the door erupted from its mouth. We quickly moved on. The next door was wide open. The room was covered in webs. A single light bulb on the ceiling was the only spot uncovered by the webs. And inside of the room was only one piece of furniture. We could see an empty throne. It was covered in cobwebs, too thick to see if the throne was wood or gold. On the floor of the room I could see more webs so thick that we couldn't see the floor. And far in the shadows, we could see 8 reflective gems on the web-covered walls. Gems that seemed to be staring at us. We quickly left that door behind when we heard steps in the hallway. Quick and heavy steps. We turned to each other, and we both nodded silently as we both ducked, and we quickly moved without making noise, away from those steps. We knew those steps very well. The only people who could afford boots with steel toes was Bathory's Civil Legion. Most of the time, they were just standing around, bored, maybe escorting someone important. When they walked like that, though, like that they were marching to a beat that no one else could hear, they were looking for someone. And everyone knew that if the Civil Legion was looking for someone, and if they found you instead, they may take you instead. It could be for any reason at all. Making eye contact, avoiding eye contact, too dirty, too clean, too fast, too slow, too loud, too quiet, too young, too old, too ugly, too pretty. Could be any reason at all, or no reason at all, and all you could do was hide away from the Civil Legion and hope that the person they take away isn't you. The hallway had turns we could make, and we continued moving as quickly as we could in silence. But still, the steps were getting closer and closer. I turned to Nadia, and we could see in our expressions what we had to do. We couldn't run away from the officer. We could only hide. We peeked through the doors as we ran by, trying to judge which ones were safe to hide in, and which ones were as dangerous as our stalker. One room we saw had someone held in both chains and hooks, their skin peeled away from their flesh and bone. The noises they were making weren't screams nor moans of pain. Another door we peeked through had a bunch of children huddled around a single candle. Their eyes were as black as leather and all focused on the candle's flame. When I finally came to a door where someone was focused on playing cards in front of them, I turned to Nadia and nodded towards the door I was facing, while Nadia shook her head and she entered the door across from me. We weren't going to hide together, because when we hide together, we are more likely to be caught. If we hide separately, then if one of us gets caught, then the other could escape. Something we learned from playing hide and seek over the years, but also something we learned from hiding from the Civil Legion. When everyone hides in the same place, all it takes is one person getting caught to mean that everyone got caught. So while I hid in the room with the figure reading the cards, Nadia hid across from me. I carefully ducked behind the door, so even if they peered inside, like I had been doing, that I wouldn't be seen, keeping the door cracked open, because as tempting as it was to close the door to feel safer, I knew that if all of the doors were cracked open and suddenly one door was closed, then it would look more suspicious to the officer, not less suspicious. I listened to the steps approach, closer and closer. I closed my eyes and slowed my breathing quietly and being so careful to not touch the door. Years of experience in hiding came through in that moment as I stood still and the steps approached. When the officer was just outside of the room, I could see the door vibrate in its hinges. But the officer continued down their patrol without hesitating nor slowing. The steps grew further and further distant until finally they faded away into nothing. Then I started breathing normally when I turned back to the table where I could see the woman staring at her cards. She didn't notice me. She only focused on her cards, which looked blank where I was, but I couldn't help myself as I asked, "Do you need help leaving?" I asked her. She shook her head as she shuffled her 3 cards and she played them again, looking at her cards. No, I can't leave this place. Not until I have an answer for my future that I like," she said as she shuffled her cards again. The same 3 cards as she played them out again. Maybe in the same order as before, and maybe in a different order, but they all looked the same, so I couldn't tell if there was any difference. Why? I don't like that future either. I need something different before I can leave," she said as she shuffled her cards yet again. And I stepped closer to a table, a short card table, while she sat on the floor, looking over the blank cards. "If you don't like what the cards say, why don't you leave them and come out?" I asked her as she finally looked up at me. Her red sunken eyes stared into my eyes. She clearly hadn't slept in a long time, and I don't think she had thought about anything but her own future. "The cards tell the future. I can't leave unless there's a good future for me, but every time I ask them for the future, it always ends the same way, every time," she said as she shuffled again. And she laid her cards down as she yelled again, slamming her hands on the table. Same. Why is it always the same? It shouldn't be doing that," she said as I spoke up again. "If your future is always the same when you stay in here, do you think leaving the room might change your future?" I asked her as she glanced up at me before she sighed and focused on the cards again. "You're a child, so you don't know better. But if you knew how your future ended, you would stay here until it changed too," she said while shuffling her cards. And at first, I thought I would ask her how my future would end. But then I remembered what my father said in his story, and I looked back at the woman, shuffling her same 3 cards, hoping that they would show her a different future, never making any choices, and always hoping that things would get better without her making any choices. A hope without a will. A change without determination. I stepped to the door as I turned to the woman, and I called out, "I'll leave the door open so that you can leave when you want to," I told her. She focused on her cards, not looking up at me. I stepped into the hallway where I saw Nadia also exiting her room and leaving the door open just a crack. "What was in your room?" I asked Nadia. "There was a man who kept trying to rewrite history by removing pages from a book and then writing different pages to try and sew his pages into the book. But there was always more pages he needed to remove, always more of the past that needed to be expunged before he could replace them with his own pages. His pile of removed pages was taller than he was, and the pages he wrote was blank, not even started." "What was in your room?" "There was a woman who kept seeing the future in her cards. She refused to leave her room nor make any choices because she didn't like how her future ended. So she kept shuffling the same 3 cards over and over, hoping that the cards would tell her a different future, so that way she could finally leave. Too afraid of the future to see the present. After that, we turned where the officer came from as we wandered down the hallway, turning the corner and making our way to where we thought the exit may be. We had no reason to assume it was the way out, but it felt like the way out. It felt like the place that our parents may have been taken down. As the doors grew further and further apart in the hallway, we continued down the hallway where we could see a big, grand door. It was like something out of an old history book. 3 concentric circles that showed different worlds, all connected by a single tree. Upper world had clouds and palaces, where the branches of the tree were. Middle world showed mountains, cities, and people, where the trunk of the tree was. And then, in the center, was lower world, where there was fire and a throne, one that resembled the one room we saw. This was where the roots of the tree were at. Felso, Kosepso, also, all connected by Vilakfa, Nadia said as she touched the door, and the door opened. Light beyond the house as we exited the pumpkin house together.